Hello, my name's Scott McKenzie, and I'm doing a personal lecture for HD 1170 Adolescence and Emerging Adulthood. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is risk factors for high school dropouts. And what we'll start with is an overview of high school dropouts. What we see here is that over 3 million high schoolers are dropping out each year, which makes up about 8.1% of our high school population, and I've even seen higher statistics in other places. Now, this is happening all over the world, and of course in the United States. And in the United States, where we'll focus today, it's specifically happening most prominently in urban settings. And the problem with this is that we're seeing that it causes a disruption of the integration process into adulthood from adolescence and into society as a whole. And we've touched on this a little bit in class. Now, what we typically think of now of why people are dropping out of school. Some of the classic examples are just because they're not interested, they're falling behind. We see things like abuse in the family, abuse at school, unplanned parenthood, pregnancies, or need to drop out to take care of their family members. However, what I'd like to talk about today are perhaps the fact that there may be some other causes for this that we haven't considered, and two ideas I'd like to touch on today are the effect of drug use on dropouts, and more surprisingly perhaps, the use of the implications of teenage dating with high school dropouts. So first, with drug use, I'm going to talk about a study done by Joseph Gasper in 2011. So this was a study that was done as part of the National Education Longitudinal Study, NELS, and it was for over 11,000 students. It was a large study. And what he found was that, perhaps unsurprisingly, students who had poor grades were also those who were more likely to use illegal drugs. Now, these studies were done on 8th, 10th, and 11th graders. In addition to that, he found that dropouts were 10% more likely to have recently used cannabis in the last month. So those that had just dropped out were 10% more likely than those that had not to have recently used cannabis. Now, this might not be very surprising, but I just wanted to point out that there may be some other sources. Now, perhaps the more interesting example is teenage dating. And a study here by Pamela Orfinas that was just published this year has some incredible results. So she did a study on a little over 600 students, and it was a 7-year longitudinal study. And what she did is she asked these students about their dating habits and risky behaviors. And then on top of that, she also spoke to these students' teachers to see what sort of students they were and what their study skills were like. So after questioning all the students, they were placed into 4 different dating trajectories as follows. The first trajectory were those who had never or hardly reported dating throughout middle school and high school. This was called the low dating group. The second trajectory were students who dated infrequently in middle school, but perhaps began to increase their dating frequency in high school. This was labeled increasing. Now, these two groups, teachers reported these two groups as having the best study skills, and this was the not at risk 2 trajectories for these students. Now, the 2 at-risk trajectories were as follows. The first was those who had high middle school dating, so they dated a lot in middle school. And the second were those that reported dating at almost all the measuring points throughout the study. So these people were labeled as frequent studiers. So these 2 trajectories that were labeled at risk were labeled by their teachers as having significantly worse study skills. And on top of that, these students were also 4 times as likely to drop out of school as those from the 2 not at-risk trajectories. So what are some of the implications of this? Well, what I'd like to point out is that perhaps there are other sources that are leading to adolescents dropping out that we haven't considered before. And if we're able to better understand these things, we can have early intervention programs, and we can prevent people from dropping out, prevent adolescents from dropping out of high school. Now, why would we want this? Well, we've seen in class that completing high school allows for better integration into adulthood. Why is this? Well, dropouts have lower earnings and higher unemployment rates, higher incarceration rates. In fact, 75% of crimes are committed by dropouts in the United States. We also see increased teen pregnancy rates and even lower life expectancy, which is quite surprising and astounding. And so we can see why we would want to lower these high school dropout rates. Now, another implication of this research is that there's a lot of things that we consider positive in development that we've hit on in class, and we need to separate perhaps the positive components from the negative components. For example, when we talk about drug use, we think about autonomy and making one's own decisions as they're developing through adolescence. And while this is good, we also need to consider the dangers that come with this and the implications of these decisions leading to things like dropping out of high school. And as far as what we saw with high school dating, that's part of the emotional development that we talked about in class as far as developing intimacy and building relationships. But we also need to look at some of these from the perspective of distractions in school and how they could lead to poor decisions such as dropping out of high school. And that does it for my personal lecture. I just wanted to point out that there's perhaps room for research in these areas that could lead to some interesting developments and could perhaps help us keep adolescence on the right track and integrating into adulthood correctly. So thank you very much, and I'm Scott McKenzie.